Your miklat. So today, the final area I want to discuss is the idea of Kohen Gadol. Right? The Torah says that when a Rotzeach b'shogeg goes to an Yer Miklat, the Rotzeach b'shogeg remains in the Yer Miklat and is vulnerable to the Gayel Hadam if he steps out, and we discussed that yesterday, until the Kohen Gadol dies. Again, let me just go back and make an obvious point. The Yer Miklat has two different functions, and it's very important to know this. The Yer Miklat is a protection for the Rotzeach. It protects the Rotzeach from the Goel Adam. But if that's all it would be, let's say the Rotzeach is rich. The Rotzeach can hire private security. He says, thank you for the offer of Ari Miklat, but I'd rather stay in my mansion and have my private security guards. Can a Rotzeach simply say, I'll take care of my own security? So the answer is no, because Yer Miklat is not only protection, it is also an onesh and a kapara for the sin of being careless. And as a result, it's not something that you can waive. The Rotzeach cannot waive the protection of the Yer Miklat. It is a mandatory chiyuv. But it terminates with the misa of the Kohen Gadol. So today I want to talk about a very fascinating halachic issue. Tomorrow I'll talk about more of the hashkafa here. Right now, we're not going to go over the reason why Misas Kohen Gadol sets him free. But the Mishnah in Makos draws a very interesting distinction between a Gemar Din where there is a Kohen Gadol and a Gemar Din where there's not a Kohen Gadol. Remember the procedure. When a guy kills, he immediately should go to the Yer Miklat. He is then summoned. He is brought to a Sanhedrin of 23. And they decide, is he mazid, is he shogeg, is he putter, because he's nothing. He didn't do it. Assuming he is then sentenced as a shogeg, he is sent back to the Yer Miklat. And he remains there until the Kohen Gadol dies. What if there was no Kohen Gadol at the time of his Gemar Din? What if at the time of his sentencing, the preceding Kohen Gadol had already died, and they had not yet appointed a new Kohen Gadol? That is a very bad situation for the Rotzeach, because at that point, he never goes free. His sentence is life, because there was no Kohen Gadol at the time of the Gemar Din. So even if a Kohen Gadol is appointed a day after Gemar Din, he is not Yotzei Misham Liolam. Masha'en Kain, if there is a Kohen Gadol b'shas Gemar Din, even if the Kohen Gadol dies a day later, the Rotzeach goes free. So it makes a big difference. If a Kohen Gadol is appointed on Monday, and my Gemar Din is on Monday, I will be freed when the Kohen Gadol dies. But if my Gemar Din is on Monday, and the Kohen Gadol is not appointed until Tuesday, at that point, Eino Yotzei Misham La'olam, and the reason is because there has to be a Kohen Gadol at the time of the Sanhedrin's determination that you are a shogeg that's chayav galus. Yeah.
Why doesn't the Sanhedrin wait for a Kohen to be appointed?
Yeah. So the question is, are they allowed to wait? So there's it might be so. The Gemara doesn't mention that. There is a halacha called Inoi Hadin. We don't delay judgment, but that refers to a different scenario. That means once a person is sentenced, we carry out the sentence right away. But in terms of delaying the beginning of the procedure, I believe halachically you're allowed to do that. So I don't know. It's a good question. Practically, could a Rotzeach argue as a matter of compassion, although it may not be much better because the Kohen Gadol might live 50 years, but as a matter of compassion, could he say, listen, can we wait until there is a Kohen Gadol? I don't know a halachic reason why you couldn't do that, but I'm not aware of any chazal that says they did it. I don't know, yeah.
Is the Kohen Gadol appointment for life? Like what if he resigns? Is it when he dies or is it when the next Kohen Gadol?
Yeah. So a Kohen Gadol, all right, so this is interesting. A Kohen Gadol can resign, but he still has the halachos. Now, he can resign the responsibilities of being a Kohen Gadol. He's old, he's sick. But in terms of his misa, taking the guy out of the Yer Miklat, he would still have the din of a Kohen Gadol. So that wouldn't change that, per se. So now, yeah.
If the second Kohen Gadol dies, would he also be freed? If he doesn't?
Which one?
Is the Kohen Gadol who's the Kohen Gadol at the time of the day?
Yes. So actually, the Gemara says either one. In other words, there might be more than one person whose death might release you, either Cohen A or Cohen B. The Gemara discusses that. So here, the Gemara has a fascinating shaila, a very, very fascinating shaila. What if you have a Kohen Gadol, and on Monday the Rotseach is sentenced, and you have a Kohen Gadol, but we discover a day later that the Kohen Gadol is actually Puzzle, and he's not a Kohen, he's a Ben Gerusha or Ben Chalutza. Right, what's Ben Gerusha? A simple example. If a Kohen marries a divorced woman, which he's not allowed to do, the child that they have, although his father is a Kohen, he is called a Chalal. A Chalal is a desecrated child. He's not a mamzer. He's a kosher Jew. He's not a mamzer. But a Chalal is not a Kohen. A Chalal is not a Kohen. A Chalal is a Zor. So the shaila is like this. If a Kohen Gadol is discovered to be a Ben Gerusha or Ben Chalutza, so l'mafreya, he's not a Kohen. As we discover, let's say we didn't know his mother got a get before she married his father. So, how do you analyze that? Now, the Gemara has two possibilities, and each possibility is a shtickle chiddush. According to possibility number one, we treat the paslis of a Kohen as a form of death. It's ke'ilu the Kohen Gadol died, because he's not a Kohen anymore. And if he died, the Rotseach goes free. Now that itself is a chiddush, because that means death doesn't have to be biological death. The guy's alive. But the fact that he's puzzle is ke'ilu he died. The Kohen died. The Kohen died. The Yisrael is alive, but the Kohen died. So that's called Mesa Kahuna, which means the Rotseach goes free. But there's another opinion that says, well, wait a second. If we discover he's a Ben Gerusha, that means he never was a Kohen. So it's Nigmar Dinai without a Kohen Gadol. So he's not Yaitse Misham Liolam. So this is the way the Gemara discusses the Machlokes. One Mandi Amar says Mesa Kahuna. It's Ke'ilu the Kahuna died, which would be a leniency. So the Rotseach goes free. The other Mandi Amar says Botla Kahuna. The Kahuna is retroactively annulled. So there was no Kohen Gadol B'shas Gemar Din, assuming he's the only Kohen Gadol involved. So B'chiyai Gavna, what's going to be the halacha? Eino Yotze Misham Liolam. He never gets out, right? He never gets out because there was no. We thought there was a Kohen Gadol, but that was a mistake. There was no Kohen there. So this is a machlokas in the Gemara. Now the Gemara then wants to connect the machlokas to another machlokas. And you'll see the connection here. That is, what if a Kohen, not a Kohen Gadol, a regular Kohen did Avodah, brought korbanos, was zorek the blood. And we discover this regular Kohen is a Ben Gerusha. What is the retroactive effect on all the korbanos that he brought? It's very, very important. Now, some things you couldn't fix. If he brought the korban tamid yesterday, and I discover he's a Ben Gerusha today, what's lost is lost. But there are going to be cases where it makes a difference. He brought the korban tamid today, and now today we discover he's a Ben Gerusha. We still have time to bring a replacement tamid. Or if you brought a sin offering, you brought a korban chatas. If a non-Kohen sacrificed your korban chatas, you're not yotze, you got to bring another korban chatas. So if you'd be a non-Kohen, for sure that would be the din. What is the din if it's Naidalai Shu Ben Gerusha? So according to one Mandi Amar, any avodah that the Ben Gerusha did when people didn't know what his status was, b'di'evet is kosher. And it's only prospectively we don't let him do the avodah. The other Mandi Amar says, retroactively, we know he's not a Kohen, so every single korban that he brought is invalid. So to the degree you could make it up, you have to make it up. If you can't make it up, you can't make it up, but whatever could be made up could be made up. So you see what the Gemara is saying. So the Gemara wants to say in Makos that this second machlokes is exactly going to be Mesa Kahuna or Butla Kahuna. Do I say that when we discover you're a Ben Gerusha, retroactively you weren't a Kohen? Or do I say, now that we know there's a psul, you're not a Kohen mikano lahaba, but you did have the status of a Kohen before, right? So this would be an afkamina lagabe, the kashrus of avoda, in the case of a regular Kohen, who becomes a Ben Gerusha. And it would be a similar nafkamina, the Gemara wants to say, Lagabi, the Kohen Gadol, who becomes who we now know is a Ben Gerusha, in the sense of whether Mesa Kahuna or Butler Kahuna. So the Gemara wants to be Tola, right? Tola, the machlokas of Mesa Kahuna or Butler Kahuna, with the machlokas regarding the kashrus of the Avaida after we discover he's a Ben Gerusha in terms of the retroactive effect. It seems to be, at the first glance, a relatively logical connection, right? You can see how this machlokas is connected to that machlokas. Yeah.
Would it be possible for such a Kohen Gadol to survive the Avoda on Yom Kippur? Meaning that would he have to been a pretty recently anointed Kohen Gadol?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, listen, if a Kohen Gadol, even if he was a kosher Kohen Gadol, technically, if he was not righteous, he would not survive. But it didn't mean he died instantaneously. He would die in the course of the year. So it wouldn't necessarily be so that he would be struck dead in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. But okay, I don't know. But that's a good point. Okay, so the Gemara then says the following. The Gemara then says it wants to disassociate the question of the kashrus of avoda with the question of Kohen Gadol and Galus by saying that the issue of the kashrus of the avoda, even though we know he's a Ben Gerusha, is based on psukim, special drashos that don't automatically apply to your miklat. So even if by your miklat I say he's retroactively not a Kohen, by avoda I might say it's kosher. And the Gemara actually gives two sources for why the avoda of a Ben Gerusha would be kosher b'di'evet, even though he's not a Kohen, right? Even though l'maisa he's not a Kohen. If a non-Kohen did it, it wouldn't be kosher b'di'evet, but by a Ben Gerusha who's a not Kohen because of halal, there are psukim that say it's kosher. And the Gemara gives two drashas. One drasha is from Parshas Pinchas, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Pinchas, in recognition of the zealousness that you showed for Hashem, so it says, "V'hayisal lo ulazaro HaRav," there will be to him and all of his descendants a covenant with Hashem. So the Gemara has a drasha, since it says the words kol zara, all of the descendants of Pinchas. The word kol, it could have said, v'hayisal lo ulazara, right? Why kol? So we darshan, bein zera kosher, bein zera pasal, that all of the descendants of a Kohen are kosher b'di'evet, for the avoda, if we didn't know that they were pasal, even if they're chalalim. That's one proof, or one drasha. The other drasha is from Moshe Rabbeinu's blessing to Shevet Levi in Zos HaBracha, where Moshe Rabbeinu says, Barech Hashem Chelo. Hashem should bless Chelo, the hosts of Levi. But Chelo is also similar to the word Chalal. Hashem blesses even the Chalal that the Avodah is kosher. Okay, so the point I'm making is the Gemara in Makos initially wanted to say that if I hold Batla Kahuna by Galus retroactively, there's no Kahuna, the Avodah is going to be pasal. The Gemara says no. Even if retroactively he's not a Kohen Gadol, the Avodah is not going to be puzzle, either because of Baruch Hashem Chelo or Haisalo Ulazar. By the way, I want to correct myself. In the pasuk Haisalo Ulazaro, I said, I think it said Kol Zaro. It does not say Kol Zaro. It just says Zaro. Haisalo Ulazaro, bris. But the Gemara's drasha is Zaro means all of the Zara. Zara means all of the descendants, whether it's kosher or puzzle. It does not actually say the word kol in the puzzle. Okay, so again, this is just a bit of knowledge to be aware of. Let me point out the Gemara in Kedushin then asks an interesting kasha. It says, if you're darshaning that even Zera puzzle, b'di'eved, the avoda is good, when you discover it later, then what about a balmum, right? If a Kohen does avoda and he has a physical blemish, the avoda is puzzle. Well, what if, let's say the Kohen was not aware that he had a broken leg. Sometimes you can have a fracture and not be aware of it. And he did avoda and then discovers he had a mum at the time of the avoda. By a balmum, the avoda is puzzle, even though you didn't know about the mum till later. So the Gemara asks the kasha, my shna, why when I discover he's a ben gerusha, the avoda is kosher, but when I discover he's a balmum, the avoda is puzzle. You got to bring the korban again. Isn't it the same question? At the time of the avoda, we thought he was a kosher Kohen. We now discover he was not a kosher Kohen. So what's the difference that by Ben Gerusha you say it is good, b'di'eved, and by Balmum you say it's no good, b'di'eved. So the Gemara asks the kasha, and it says, it doesn't give a svara, but again it uses diyukim, inferences in the psukim. Because in Parshas Pinchas, when Hashem said that I made a covenant with the children, so it says, Hineni no sein lo, I give to Pinchas a bris, a covenant of shalom, of peace. Now the word shalom in the Torah, in that pasuk only, the vav is called a vav katia. A vav katia means a truncated or cut off vav. And how that is written is a machlokas. Some say it's only a half vav, meaning it doesn't go all the way down. It's a half vav. Some say it's a two-part vav, in which the two halves are written, but it's cut. But it's a truncated vav. So, the truncated vav is a remez that you read the pasuk as if the vav is deleted. If you take out the vav from the word shalom, so the word would be read shalem, perfect, unblemished. Meaning, when does Hashem give the covenant that even if the Kohen is puzzle, the avodah is good? Only when the Kohen is shalem and not when he's a balmum. So that is the chiluk between ben gerusha, where the avodah is kosher, b'di'eved, and balmum, where the avodah is puzzle b'di'eved, because the haftacha of the Torah, that even when the children are puzzled, children of Kohanim are puzzled, the avodah is kosher, only applies to a shalem and not to a balmum, and that's based on the truncated vav, where the word shalom gets read as shalem. This is a Gemara in Kedushin. So, There's an interesting kasha. When the Rambam lists the requirements of how a Sefer Torah is supposed to be written, the Rambam does not mention the Vav Katia in Parshas Pinchas. The Rambam does not mention Hineni no sein lo es brisi shalem. And why does the Rambam not mention the Vav Katia? This is seemingly a requirement of the Gemara itself. Now, how did the Gemara know it? Halacha Moshe Messina, that makes it even more chamer, but at least the Gemara records that Sifrei Torah are supposed to be written with a Vav Katia. How could the Rambam leave it out? Right? Why doesn't the Rambam mention the Vav Katia of Parshas Pinchas? So the Meshech Chachma brings well, actually, he only alludes to it. Without the footnote, you wouldn't know. In other words, the Meshech Chachma just says, Ayin, look at the Sefer Batei Kahuna. There's a Sefer Batei Kahuna written from the 16th century for a beautiful answer. He doesn't say what the answer is, but if you look at the annotated Meshech Chachmas, they quote the teretz from the Sefer Batei Kahuna. And here is the cheshbon. The Gemara, you'll remember, gives two different makoros of why a Ben Gerusha's Avodah will be kosher after the fact. One is the promise to Pinchas, Hay salo ulazaro acharav bris kahunas olam, that all of your children will have the status of kahuna for Avodah, even if they're puzzle. That's one source. The other source for the same halacha was Baruch Hashem Chelai, that's Moshe Rabbeinu's blessing to Shevet Levi, that God blesses even the Chalalim. Chalalim are Ben Grusha. Now, here is the Batei Kahuna's diuk. The Gemara gives those two drashos. Then the Gemara asks, I hachi, if a Ben Gerusha's Avodah is kosher, Baal Mum Nami. A Baal Mum's Avodah should be kosher. Right, the Gemara asks it. Now, says the Batei Kahuna, the Gemara's kasha is only a kasha based on one of the drashas. It's not a kasha based on the other drasha. Meaning, like the drasha that says all of Pinchas's zera is kosher. So then you could ask, how do you know that's limited to Ben Gerusha? Maybe it should encompass Baal Mum. Then you have a kasha. But if you're using the second limud, Baruch Hashem Chelo, you can't ask a kasha of Baal Mum Nami. The Gezeres HaKasav of Baruch Hashem Chelo is only talking about Chalalim, Ben Gerusha. You can't ask I hachi, Baal Mum Nami. The drasha is Chalal specific. So says the Batei Kahuna, when the Gemara asks the kasha, if you're machshir a Ben Gerusha, you should be machshir a Baal Mum. It is only asking the kasha if the hechsher of the Ben Gerusha is from v'hay salo ulazaro acharav bris kahunas olam. But if the heter of the Ben Gerusha is Baruch Hashem Chelai, Baal Mum would have no basis at all because that's not covered by that drasha. So it turns out, when the Gemara asks the kasha, what about a Baal Mum, and it has to answer, the Vav Katia tells me that the promise is only if it's Shalem and not Chaser. That is needed only if the drasha to be Machshir the Ben Gerusha is from Hay Solo Ulazaro Acharav. But if the drasha to be Machshir, the Ben Gerusha, is Baruch Hashem Chelai, I don't need the Vav Katia to darshan that the Baal Mum is not covered. The Baal Mum will not be covered simply because there is no pasuk that would be Machshir. So the Batei Kahuna wants to say that since the Rambam holds that the Iker Drasha for the Ben Gerusha is from Baruch Hashem Chelai, we know that the Baal Mum will not be kosher without the Vav Ketiyah. So the Vav Ketiyah no longer serves a halachic purpose, and that is why the Rambam does not count it as something required in a Sefer Torah. This is very, very Eloyish, but to me it's extremely problematical, because the requirements of how you write a Sefer Torah are b'pashtus halacha l'Moshe misinai. So whether there's a halachic drasha that you get from it or not, I mean, the most that the Batei Kuna establishes is there's no halachic drasha that the Rambam would get from the truncated vav. Okay. Well, what halachic drasha do we get from the big Dalet in Echad? I mean, there are numerous requirements in how you write a Sefer Torah. And presumably Hashem has secret reasons, but there's a lot of, most of us, most Chachamim, do not have an explicit reason why this is here, and this is here, and this is here. It's Halach l'Moshe Misinai. So, to me, I don't get clear the methodology here. In other words, the Sefer Batei Kahuna says that like the drasha of Baruch Hashem Chelai, you don't need the Vav Ketiyah to exclude the Baal Mum, because the Baal Mum would never be included anyway. Okay, got it. But just because you've eliminated the drasha of the Vav Ketiyah, I don't know how that's going to eliminate the requirement of the Vav Ketiyah, because then it just becomes like numerous ways you write a Sefer Torah in which we don't have an exact halachic reason why it has to be done, other than Allah l'Moshe Misinai. So to me, that's actually a tzarachian. It's an ingenious, brilliant answer, but the predicate of the answer seems very, very difficult. That just because you've eliminated the halachic drasha, how would that impact on eliminating the requirement? So tzarachian, again, I don't want to get overly technical, but just I wanted to share with you that little shtickle Torah. The Ohr Somayach actually, the Meshech Chacham actually is chaylik and the Batei Kuna for another reason, which again, ein kan makom laharich. Okay. The final thing, and I'll probably continue with tomorrow though, gets us back into the hashkafa of it, and that is, what on earth does the death of the Kohen Gadol have to do with the Rotzeach b'Shogeg being liberated? Now, obviously, it's bichlal a very, very strange sentence, because it's an indeterminate sentence. Assuming there's a Kohen Gadol b'shas Gemar Din, so if the Kohen Gadol dies a minute later, guy goes free. If the Kohen Gadol dies 50 years later, guy waits 50 years. If the guy dies first, he's buried in the Yer Miklat, not to be exhumed until the Kohen Gadol dies. So, I guess the first question, there are a lot of questions. The first question is, well, you have two guys that are Rotzchem b'Shogeg. One guy gets out after a day, and one guy gets out after 25 years. They did the same thing. They should pay the same sentence. So one answer might be, but this is really, really hard to coordinate. I guess only God could do this job. Is the following. Not all shogegs are created equally, meaning on the continuum of shogeg, there's infinite points. Negligent, bit more negligent. Only God can measure. So the issue would be that the death of the Kohen Gadol will be timed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to correspond to the relative culpability of the people who are in the Arei Miklat. Meaning to say that if you manage to get out after a day, it's because Klape Shemaya, your shogeg was not so bad, and you only needed a one-day kapara. And if you wind up staying in the Yer Miklat 40 years, Kalape Shmaya, your shogeg was so serious, meaning negligent, careless, that you needed 40 years. So the indeterminacy of the sentence is a heavenly judgment regarding the infinite levels of culpability that people who kill b'shogeg can have. Okay, that's exactly it. The reason why different people, some people get out early, some people get out late, is because all of them are guilty of this crime, but there are different targets. I get it, but the problem is, we'd have to have records. And I mean, you can have, let's say, many people sent to the Yer Miklat the same day. I mean, they're not all going to be on the same level. Meaning, when the Kohen Gadol dies, it's not just one guy who gets released. It's like everybody gets released. So, well, this is why God is God. I mean, how does the Kadosh Baruch Hu cheshbonize the fact that there are different people there, and there are different levels there, and how, if it would be like a one-to-one thing, I understand. Some people get early release, some people get late release, but there are a whole bunch of people get released. So it is difficult, but at least in theory, this is the way you cheshbon it, that bidei shamayim, the amount of time a Rotzeach spends in the Yer Miklat is totally on his culpability. By the way, culpability is not only a function of negligence, meaning the more negligent, the more culpability. It may also be a function of madrega. For example, if you're a tzaddik, you're a righteous person, then you might be held to a higher standard, and even a lower degree of negligence might justify a longer kapara. So it's both a question of how bad was the negligence and what standard should you be held accountable to. Okay, so that explains partially the indeterminacy of the sentence. But that doesn't yet explain why is it connected to the Kohen Gadol. Right? Why that? Pick something else. Yeah, you're saying?
Oh yeah, I was going to say because in previous Shiurim, maybe a couple months ago and before, we were talking about how when we get later into the second period, because the Kohen Gadol position was all being auctioned off, so they were not lasting a year.
Yeah.
Everyone was, so in other words, part of the cheshbon isn't just the people in the Yer Miklat, it's also if the Kohen Gadol is righteous. So there's so much being factored into the
Yep. You are. That is actually a very, very good question. Meaning to say, I described an explanation that, if it makes sense at all, only makes sense if the only reason the Kohen Gadol dies is to free the people in the Yer Miklat. But a Kohen Gadol might die for a gazillion different reasons, and let's assume he's dying because he was not proper in the Avodas Yom Kippur. Then it may turn out that a Rotzeach gets a bonus. Maybe he deserves to be there longer, but he gets out because the Kohen Gadol died early for another reason. You're right. That would throw a wrench into this cheshbon. Yeah.
Also, I'm going to assume that you get a generation. The generation itself is also less righteous. So the Rotzeach will probably need more time to do it.
If what? Say again. If.
I would assume that the generation itself is also less righteous. And therefore,
Yeah.
the Rotzeach would need to be in a longer in order to achieve the...
Yeah, that might be so as well, meaning to say, I guess the common denominator is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will keep the Rotzeach in the Yer Miklat for as long as he needs for any variety of reasons. Yeah. So now, the Gemara says in... Yeah.
Is it possible to reason in the other direction and say, if we're in an age where even the Kohen Gadol is not so righteous anymore, how can we keep this poor man in exile for so long? What can we expect of someone if the Kohen Gadol isn't so pure? How can we punish somebody for too long?
Now, are you trying to explain why when the Kohen Gadol dies, he goes free?
Or why he might go...
I mean, you might make the...
He might go sooner if the Kohen Gadol dies.
But if you took your argument, you can conclude that we shouldn't send him to the Yer Miklat at all, because...
Well, only if you take it to the extreme.
Okay, it could be. And that ties into the last thing I'm going to say, which I'll continue tomorrow, and that is, the Gemara in Makos says that the Kohen Gadol, in theory, this was not always the case, is supposed to be the spiritual leader of the generation. Supposed to be. Again, actually, in most of history, that actually was not the case. But in theory, the Kohen Gadol is the one who is our Gadol Hador, our spiritual leader. And a Kohen Gadol is responsible to be mispalel for Am Yisrael. And part of his tefillos are that these accidents shouldn't happen, these tragedies shouldn't happen. And if there are murders, if there are homicides on his watch, the Kohen Gadol is considered to be spiritually accountable for the tragedies that occurred in his office. Hoya lo lehispalel, he should have davened with more kavanah or whatever. And as a result, his death is God's final punishment for these murders. And therefore the Rotzeach gets a kapara through the death of the Kohen Gadol, who should have been mispalel for the generation. That's an amazing thing, because that basically says the Kohen Gadol is considered to be the sinner, the ultimate sinner, behind the pu'ulos of Ritzicha, at least b'shogeg, that come out of carelessness and the like. And that is why the Misas Kohen Gadol frees the Rotzchem from the Yer Miklat. This is what the Gemara in Mako says. I'll mention tomorrow something from the Yerushalmi that gives a bit of a different reason. Okay, see you tomorrow.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.